What up, T-Kid?
What up, brother?
So what's up, everybody? Welcome to Museum of Graffiti's Oral History Podcast. I'm Ket1. Today we have T-Kid 170 in the house.
That's right.
This podcast is sponsored by our good friends at Modelo. Thank you,
Modelo
Modelo,
beer.
for hooking us up. We've
Word.
got some great beer in the house. And tonight we've got the notorious T-Kid 170 from the Bronx.
Boogie down all the way, man. You know,
So T, the point of this podcast is for us to get into stories of the past, to learn about your history, and to learn about the things that you witnessed in real life, and to share these histories. You know, you're someone that's had a long career in art,
right.
and has overcome obstacles, and seen a lot, and have demonstrated a fighting spirit in your life. And so we want to learn about that.
Right.
And so I'm going to take you way back in time.
Ooh.
And kind of get you to give us a little bit of your background. And so tell me a little bit about your work in the late 70s when you started in the early 80s, and how your style came to be.
So, in the 70s, before I got to the 80s, a lot of people think I'm from the 80s, but actually I've been writing for a long time. I was a toy like everybody, and, I came up through the ranks. I was tagging out, window tagging and dumb stuff, the toy stuff. I was a toy. I went through several names from King 13. I went to Sen 102. When I was writing Sen 102, I was writing with cats like Danko, Smokey, Diamond Dave on the 6 line, And, at that time you had Sax, you had OK. These guys was killing, man. Think Aztec. Aztec was killing it at that time. And I'm telling you because this is the things that I saw. But prior to that, like in the late 60s on Burnside Avenue, my mother was taking me to my uncle's house. He lived down on 137th in Amsterdam in the projects, by old Broadway or West Broadway, whatever they call it. And from them projects, you could see this amusement park called Playland, and I used to love going down there. And I remember one particular time, and this is what really planted the seed, was Burnside Avenue is a 3-platform train station, right? And in the weekends, they would have what they call layups. They would lay up the train over the weekend. And I remember seeing kids tagging inside. Like I heard the doors opening and closing, and it kept getting closer and closer and closer. And we were there for a while because, on the weekends the trains ran slow, and this was the 4 line, right? And I heard these kids, and then I saw, and I remember my mother grabbing me and said, "Hey, listen, don't pay attention to that." Then our train came and we left. And that kind of planted the seed in me because now this is when I actually started seeing tagging, And I don't remember much of the names, but when I really got a little older and started paying attention, I would see a lot of stuff like 56, Hoyt 56, all the 56 guys, man. FDT 56.
Kid 56.
Kid before Kid 56, but yeah, I used to see him too, man, And it wasn't until 77 after, an unfortunate thing, with gangs and stuff, and I ended up in the hospital that I come up with the name T-Kid. And that was when I started. And it's funny because, I started tagging. I was on the 1 line with Pesser, with this cat named Pesser. And me and him, and I saw the evolution of the cats like Zephyr, Revolt. I was there. I saw Mackie doing cars. I saw Rasta doing cars, and I remember, like, I got to get down with this, And I remember the first car that I did as T-Kid, I want to say it was late 77. Yeah, because I remember, I was shot and, I was limping still. And I remember limping with Pessa, to the 1 tunnel. He took me to the 1 tunnel. And I did a T-Kid Pessa car, save gas, because that's when the gas crisis was happening and stuff. And that was my first car. And I remember using cans that I racked up in a bodega. I think it was Safeguard paint. It was some toy-ass paint. And my black was a Lady Martin's black outline, a flat black outline, and it was horrible, man.
So, what kind of a style did you try to do? What
like? So prior, I was trying to do like a Tracy style because Tracy was a big influence. This is when I met Tracy. I met Tracy this, so I was watching him. But prior to him.
So hang on a second. So you're talking about the legendary Tracy 168.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. You know, and he was like a big influence on me, and he was cool. And when I met him, you know, he said, do a piece, right? And I did a piece. And he looked at it and he says, you're going to have style, man. You have it in you, you know? And I was like, whoa, you know? And Tracy was a legend in the neighborhood.
Already, when you met him.
Already. And the thing is, before I met Tracy, I was hanging out with Padre because I went to school with his sister.
All right, so hang on a second. So what you're telling me is that you tagged, you did your thing, right? You eventually go to do a piece in the one tunnel with your friend Pesser, who
Right.
puts you on to like the science of going into a tunnel,
Into the tunnel, yeah.
and creeping around
Right.
and painting.
Right.
You had terrible paint. You had very little style
Very
to
little.
start. So I'm guessing if we take it a little bit back, your style was nothing like
that.
like
No,
this.
No.
Was it like chunky letters, like the Tracy big?
It was
chunky
yeah.
letters,
It was
right?
that. It was that chunky because that was what was prevalent, especially on the 4 line. You saw a lot of Tracy stuff. You know, you saw a lot of not Kid 56, Chrome 100. You saw Chrome 100.
Checker 170.
Checker
maybe?
170. You know, I'm
So
just,
did you have loops on your
I
pieces?
had the little extensions coming out because that was what caught my attention. And, you know, this is when I would chill with Padre and I would show him like what I'm doing, and he would be like, yo, dude, you know, you gotta form it a little more, you know, and
So Padre, tell us a little bit about who that, because you know, for you, these people are just people in your life.
right.
To the rest of the world, they've never either heard these names or these names are legendary names. So who was Padre?
Padre-
and what did he mean to you?
Padre Dos, may he rest in peace. He was one talent that, you know, if he wouldn't have passed away, he would have been like the man. He had this style that was amazing, and he started his career as Bach One, and he used to write Bach One, and he had a crew called TBA, the Bad Artists, you know, and that was the neighborhood crew. And this is like the people that I looked up to, Hip One, you know, all those cats and whatnot. And
And what neighborhood are we talking?
we're talking about Kingsbridge up in the Bronx and stuff, the Kingsbridge station by the Armory up there. You know, I had moved up there. In fact, you know, it's funny because he was like the first Latino family in that neighborhood. And that was the beauty about the Bronx at that time, man. It was so diverse. With, you know, you had Irish, you had Germans, you had, you know, Jewish people, you had everybody was there, you know. And we had just moved up from 170th and University. Well, I went from there to living with my father, and then back and forth to my grandmother's house, which was 192nd and Aqueduct in the Kingsbridge neighborhood. So when the weekends when I was hanging out with my mom over there, you know, that's when I would hang out with Padre. And eventually I ended up coming back and, you know, going to school with Padre's sister. And Padre was, it's funny because the way he came up, first his name was Bach One, and he changed his name from Bach One to Padre Dos, watching a New York Mets versus the Padres game. And that's where he came up with the name. And that was so cool, man. It was so simple and stuff. And it was a dope name. And, you know, he introduced me to cats like Nick 707. You know, he would tell me stories about racking up with cats like Knock, you know, cars that he did with Knock, Chain, and them. And I used to listen to this stuff, and I was like, yo. But the amazing thing was, like, after school, what Padre would do was come over to my house, and he was older than me. You know, he was like 2 years older than me or so, if I remember correctly. Him and a cat named Gerard McInerney, man. Mac, we called him Mac. He was Puerto Rican Irish guy. He was mad cool. You know, but that was the trio, me, Padre, and Gerard and stuff, right? And but Padre would sit there, and we would take paper bags, because back then, you know, you went to the bodega and you always got a paper bag with your groceries and stuff. And he said, yo, you want to do your pieces on these paper bags, right? And what you want to do is, you know, with that, you want to do the outline, but you don't want to do that piece, because you should, when you get to a yard or whatever, you should do your own creation, but you could use that as the basis, you know, the model to follow, you know, and from one piece, you could do many pieces. So we would sit there after school, and he would show me. And then he would look at me, because I was doing the chunky style that I saw, you know, that phase 2 and them cats was doing the bubble letters and stuff and trying to combine that, you know, but it was real basic, real simple. And he taught me how to flow. And he said, your pieces should be like, you know, music. It should flow, you know, it should have rhythm. You know, it shouldn't be like, you see how you did this letter? It doesn't match with this letter. It doesn't connect correct. And he started teaching me that, you know? And that's why when I did a piece for, and let me tell you, it's a lot easier to do a piece on paper than it is to actually put it up on a train. Because when I went and did that first car with Pessa, in my head, that was a burner. But when I looked at it, that was some toy, sloppy ass.
So when you did that first piece, were you already drawing with Padre?
Yeah.
Got it. So yeah, so it's a lot different in real life
It was a whole lot
than on
different.
paper.
Exactly. And that's about the time that I met that this cat named Peace, Nelson, he went to school with us too. He introduced me to Tracy 168, you know? And it was fun because at that time, Tracy had moved up from Woody Crest. He had moved up to the area he was living on Morris Avenue between Kingsbridge and 196th Street, you know? And he was, I think he had just broke up with a girl named Barbara, and that was Barbara Clooney, I remember, Barbara Cooney. And, no, Clooney, the boxer, because her uncle was that boxer, Jerry Clooney, or whatever his name was. And he had just broke up with her, and he hooked up with this other girl named Anna, and he was living with her and her and 3 little kids and stuff. And that's when I met him, and I went into that apartment, and I saw the layout that he had, man, you know. And he drew me, and I still got it, thank God, the Tracy character, you know, with the Tracy. The way he did the pieces was so simple, but yet so unique. It was amazing, the way he would just do a shadow and make a Tracy out of just shadow, you know. So he did this character, full-length character with shoes and everything, you know. And I remember looking at it, and I was like, damn, that looks like the Archies, you know. And
it did.
And yeah, it did look like the Archie character and stuff. And it was that simple. And, you know, later on, you know, I never had a clue that he actually went to art and design. You know, that
because you met him, when you met him, he's a grown man already.
He was older than me. He was like, he born 3 years older than me. He was 3 years older than me.
Right,
He was
so
Padre's age.
so he's in his early 20s.
I want to assume he was about 20, 19, 20, yeah, because I met him in 77 when I was 16. No, 77. I was 16 years old.
So he's about 20 years old.
Right.
He's probably retired already.
He was pretty much done as far as the trains and stuff.
Right.
You know?
He's retired. He'd moved on. He was already working as an artist.
I remember, yeah. I remember, so you know, I got to meet him, and I don't know, we became real tight real quick, man. You know, real tight real quick. And he took me down to NYU. He was doing a lecture there.
Okay.
You know, he took me down there, you know, and then, you know, like he didn't like smoking weed, but he liked other stuff to drink. Let's just say he liked to drink, you know. And
Maybe Modelo's.
Yeah, well, if they had Modelo's back then, I'm pretty sure he was drinking them and stuff, you know. But I remember we used to do this one thing called Jesse James, where we used to take Jack Daniels and Southern Comfort and mix it and get wrecked, right? So he took me from that. We were hanging out in the village and stuff, and he took me to Jack Stewart's house.
That was his NYU plug.
Yeah, he took me to Jack Stewart's house after that, and I tagged the door.
So for those of you that don't know, Jack Stewart was an artist, lived down in the village, worked or was connected with NYU, and wrote one of the earliest, if not the first, PhD dissertations on graffiti. So he was studying graffiti as this sort of philosophy and sociology project in the very early 1970s, and he was going around and taking pictures of the trains in the Bronx and interviewing the early writers, one of which was Tracy. And he ended up becoming a bit of a mentor and friend to Tracy. And the book that's out called Graffiti Kings was released by his wife, Regina, after Jack passed. Jack was a really interesting figure, and it's a result of Jack Stewart's archive that we have those early pictures of the beginning of piecing. Because he has pictures of like Super Cool 223's first piece and all that early stuff from 1972. So when he saw it, he knew it was something special, and then he started chasing it and studying it.
You know, it's funny because, you know, by the time I came in you know, 77, I mean, like I said, I was tagging before that and stuff. I was doing that. And pretty much the arrow was already invented. The characters in the thing were, you know, on trains was already invented, you know. But what I bring to the table was the fact that I, you know, being mentored by Padre and then being closely connected with Mike, Tracy, you know, Tracy teaching me composition, Tracy teaching me colors. You know, that's one of the things that I was known for was colors. And he was like, yo, colors. I remember he used to take me to a hardware store and he showed me basically how to rack up. And for those of you don't, you know, what racking is stealing spray paint. And the reason they called it racking up is because the spray paint was on a rack.
Yeah, right. Yeah, they're on paint racks.
They were on paint racks. And, you know, you went in there, you racked up and whatnot. And, you know, and he was like, you know, these are the colors you want to do. You always want to lay down your dark colors first and then bring the lighter colors, like from dark to lighter, you know, unless you're doing like a scene or something. Because Tracy was one of the first guys to paint murals.
Yes.
In New York City.
Yes.
To go commercial with it.
Yes.
In fact, he was so innovative that he was the first guy to advertise in the Daily News that I will paint your name on any train for $25, any name.
And he did it.
And he got one customer.
Yeah.
You know, and you would see him on the news and stuff, and he was just amazing. And,
Well,
and
he had this
he had
charisma.
he had the gift of gab. I mean, he was quick, you know. He had the gift of gab, and you know, he taught me all that stuff.
So, you know, talking about Tracy, Tracy was not just charismatic and have the gift of gab, but he also had leadership skills.
Yeah, he was.
Right?
He was a leader.
He was a leader, and so he started a crew called Wild Style that you became a part of.
Yes.
You know, for the benefit of everybody listening, what was Wild Style? And tell us a little bit about your relationship with Wild Style.
You know, before Wild Style, you know, it was Wanted. It was a crew named Wanted. You know, and you know, speaking to King 2, who is now the president of Wild Style, you know, and rightly so, because he's, you know, other than Chichi, he's one of the original members.
Yeah.
You know, and you know, from what King 2, you know, relayed to me was like, you know, they were down, you know, they was on doing Wanted and whatnot, which was I think Chichi's crew, Chichi 133. I'm not sure. I could be wrong. Don't quote me. But you know, they were interested in getting down with the INDs. The INDs was like the crew.
Independence.
The Independence. That was like the crew that was like most popular.
So this is Phase 2's crew.
That's Phase 2's crew. And at some point, Tracy was like, you know what? F that. We don't need to be down. Let's start our own crew, like Wild Style. And he called it Wild Style. And the reason he was because at first it was about the letters, doing the letters differently, you know, and being crazy. You know, you got to understand, and I get it, you know, Wild Style, Tracy said, yeah, it's letters, but it's more than just letters. It's a way of life. And if you hung out with Tracy, you would understand exactly what he meant. It was like anything goes at any time.
Tracy was dangerous.
He was very dangerous, and I was right there with him. I mean, I was young. I was full of piss and vinegar. I was ready to go, you know, and we got into a lot of fights. You know, we went to a lot of bars. We got chased. We kicked ass. We got our asses kicked. It was just like that, and it was like fun. It was fun. Like I remember one time at a club, we got fucked up by some, excuse my language, we got messed up by some bouncers and stuff, and we just laughed, man. We were like, well, we tried. They were big, man, you know, and you know, we tried, man, and that's what it was all about, man, you know. And that was Wild Style. And it wasn't just about, you know, how you did your letters. Yeah, of course, it's about, you know, flexing the letters, twisting them and turning them into something different. And one of the styles, the craziest styles that became real popular, especially from Europe, and everybody thinks it came from Europe, is something he called monster style, which is the 3D style. You know, he did that a long time before. You know, even before stencils.
No, that goes
you
way
know,
back.
Tracy, we would do stencils on T-shirts.
Yes.
You know, palm trees and stuff like that. And we would go and sell these T-shirts and, you know.
Well, one of the things about him that was special is that he understood art as business, right? He understood commercialization.
Yep.
And I don't know if that came from his relationship with Jack or if he was like a natural entrepreneur and he saw it. But the stencils, the commercial artwork, the murals, going out, you know, making his name really legible and known. You know, he built a name for himself. Right. Everybody in the Bronx knew him. Everybody in New York City knew him. He was that guy, you know. And I think it's really important for you to share that sort of connection, right? To know that you have lineage, not just stylistically, but also just human.
Exactly,
right?
Man.
There's a mentorship that happens with graffiti that people forget about, and I think now a lot of people learn from the internet, but in the 70s and the 80s,
There was none.
there was no internet.
There
You
was
learned
nothing.
from a person.
Exactly.
Right.
Everything was word of mouth and stuff. And to be that popular in all 5 boroughs, think about it. To be that popular, I mean, that's how prolific this man was. And, you know, even though you're interviewing me and I'm talking about him, he is a big part of who I am and who I became. Because he had that much influence on me, you know, and he taught me so much on how to live life and really enjoy life, you know, and understand that it's not about the 40-hour work week, that it's not about, you know, being stuck in one thing. It's about exploring every possibility that there possibly is. You know, I mean, I took it to a certain limit. After a certain limit for me, it was a little reckless to do certain things, you know. So I slowed down a lot, you know. I ended up with a family. I ended up with a city job. And, you know, at some point I had to choose what's what. And I kind of like stopped for a minute, but then I just started up again, you know. And that was the thing. And it was through Mike, once again, Mike, you know, say, yo, dude, what's going on, man?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that because, you know, when we talk about graffiti today, people sometimes, and us included, we talk about it as an art form. We talk about it as an art movement. But when you go back in time, it was an outlaw movement. And it still has that going on today for some people, but it's delineated. Back in the days, it was only outlaw.
Yeah, it was strictly outlaw.
It was an outlaw.
Vandalism.
It was
vandalism.
It was
Pure
a street movement. It was very dangerous.
Very.
And the people that were very successful at it tended to have this street savviness and toughness.
I don't give a F, you know?
You know, and I think Tracy and yourself, you exuded that, and you pushed the boundaries and really pushed the limits for a long time.
Yeah.
There's a story that I heard about that I'd love to know the truth behind it, which is about this cat who in the 80s was considered a menace.
We're talking about Cap.
We're talking about Cap. So Cap, for those of you that don't know, was this writer that in the 80s was part of a crew called MPC and went and destroyed a lot of the artwork on
you know,
train cars.
It's funny because, look, I'm the only guy who ever fought with him as far as graffiti writers. He's had fights before with other people. You know, I hear stories, this and that and the other. But you know, and it took place at Fashion Motor, so there was plenty of people there. You know,
so for those of you that don't know, Fashion Motor was a gallery
in the Bronx.
That was one of the first, if not the first, to showcase graffiti artists alongside other contemporary artists. So people know now of artists like Ron English.
Yes.
Ron English was showing at Fashion Motor in the 1980s alongside Tracy or, you know, Vulcan, whoever was, you know, Knox, Toxic, etc.
So the story, I'm gonna, you know, and the story, this is real, man. This is a real story, you know. It started with Cope too, you know, my brother, you know. And at that time, he was writing MPC, and, you know, because Cap was going over everybody, you know, MPC was not liked at all.
Well, they're in the same neighborhood, I guess, right?
Well, Morris Park, you know, it was in the Bronx, Morris Park, but, you know, they were over there and everybody else was over here. And it's funny because Cope was writing MPC, and, you know, he just wanted to get up, and he was hanging out. And I remember we caught him, me and my boys and stuff, man, you know, Ken too, Sam Deuce, man, you know. We caught him. Well, I told Ken and Sam to go to Fordham. They told us we were hanging out in St. James Park, which is down the block from where I lived, right? And someone said, the 4 train was right there. Someone said, yo, Cope 2's up there, man, tagging up or something, right? So I told Ken and Sam, yo, go to Fordham and I'll come this way. So they went to Fordham, the station, and they kind of chased them towards me. And, you know, I had a baseball bat and stuff, you know. And here comes this little kid, man. And it was Cope 2. And, you know, he was young, man. And I see him, and I'm like, oh, man, that's a kid, man. I don't want to hurt this kid. And I had a bat, and I just, you know, wanted to scare him. And I said, yo, my man, you're Cope 2, man. Yo, I'm Tiki. Yo, I know who you are, man. Yo, please, man, don't hit me with that bat, bro. And I said, yo, dude, why you writing MPC, man? You're Puerto Rican, you know, you're getting up, man. What's the deal, man? What's going on? You know? And he was like, yo, and I said, listen, don't ever get up MPC again, or the next time I see you, I will crack your head open, you know? So he went and told, and this is Cope telling me, he went to Cap and said, yo, I can't get up NPC no more, man, because, yo, that kid Tiki was going to mess me up, blah, blah, blah. You know, he was going to crack me with a baseball bat. And he told that. And it's funny because, you know, Tracy and Cap and, you know, all those guys, Tracy was friends with all those guys. Tracy was friends with everybody. He didn't care, man. You know, he had no beef with nobody.
Well, he was also much older.
And much older, right.
Beyond that.
So apparently, you know, there was the following Saturday after that, there was a show in Fashion Moda, and that was the first time I bring my artwork to Fashion Moda. And it's funny because, you know, most of that artwork that was in that show, this cat, and he's a real cool collector, man. His name is David from Lille in Paris. He bought all the artwork from there. And that's how long I had that artwork from that show. And I brought my artwork there, and there was this lady that I was talking to. She was from Panama. She was a collector, and she wanted to buy one of the drawings and stuff. And Tracy had told Cap that there was a show and T-Kid was going to be there. So when Cope went up to him and said, yo, I can't do this, I can't write NPC no more, Cap turned around and told Cope and said, yo, whoa, don't worry about it. I'll take care of it. T-Kid's going to be there this Saturday at Fashion Moda. I'm going to go down there and F him up, you know?
Right.
And it's funny because later on I asked Cope. I said, how the hell did he know I was going to be there? And he goes, Tracy told him, you know. So I was like, all right. So anyway, so that Saturday comes. So I'm talking to this lady from Panama and stuff, and you know she was interested in buying a painting and whatnot. I mean a drawing. And all of a sudden this big dude just comes in front of me. And you know, if you know Fashion Moda, the way it's laid out, there's like a little bench by the window that faces the street, right? And I was sitting there talking to the lady, and this guy comes up with the MC boots. I already knew who it was. And I look up, and I see this big redhead, I mean, big dude. I mean, the guy was weighing about 220. At that time, I was like 160 wet. But see, you gotta understand a little bit of my background. You know, I grew up with a very strict father, and he had me doing sit-ups and pull-ups, and I was solid. I was solid.
Okay.
And, you know, he taught me how to fight, and he wouldn't let me get beat up or anything. You know, he was like, yo, you beat him up, you do any way possible. You know, that's what my father taught me.
Right.
You know, growing up where I grew up in Boynton Avenue when I was living with my father, that's why I left him and went back with my mother, because my father was insane, man. You know?
So Cap rolls up.
So Cap rolls up. So you're T-Kid, huh? Yo, I hear you run the Ghost. I go to the Ghost whenever I want. Yo, dude, I stand up, and I'm still looking up at this dude. Because he was like, what, 6'5" or something? And at that time, I was about 6 feet tall. I was just getting to be 6 feet tall. I'm 6'2" now and stuff, and, you know, but he was still fucking bigger than me. And I'm looking up at this guy, and he goes, so, yo, let's fight, man. Let's go outside. And I said, outside? Boom. I broke his nose in the first shot because I learned, man. Tracy taught me that. Whenever you're going to be the first one to strike,
Okay.
and chances are, first one to strike is the first one that's going to walk away, you know? And I strike this dude, and I just started pounding on him left and right, and quick and fast, pa, 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 pa. He just reached over, and he grabbed my face, and he would not let go of my face. I mean, he was strong, but he didn't have much, you know, from what I experienced in that moment, he didn't really have hand skills. And I just kept pounding. And at one point, he tried to pivot and throw me, and there was a wall, a fake wall. I don't know if Futura did it or something. It was nice. And he tried to throw me through that wall, and I set myself down, like, while he was trying, and I used his leverage, and we flew, right? He turned, like, his back, I got him to his back towards that wall, the momentum, and he crashed through that wall, still holding onto my face, and I landed on top of him, and I kept wailing, you know, and then they broke us up. And I'm gonna tell you, man, you know, I ended up on top of him and stuff, and I remember there was blood on my face, on my shirt, and I'm like, yo, is that my blood? I mean, I got heated. I was like ready to, right? And everybody's like, nah, that's his blood, man. And I'm like, oh, wow, man, yo. And then I told Sim, I said, yo, if we start fighting again, yo, stab him. And my man was ready to do it. We're gonna kill him.
Crazy.
You know?
Crazy.
And, you know, and then Tracy came in, and like from nowhere, Tracy showed up. And then after that fight, everybody, I mean, James Top, everybody was like, yo, T-Kid, man, wow. The only one who didn't give me shine was my boy's Boozer. He was like, no, that didn't happen like that. And I'm like, yo, everybody else saw it differently.
And so at the time, was Cap going over you or not at all?
He went over a couple of my pieces, yeah. And, you know, after that fight, me and him sat down and talked, and we squashed our shit. And he told me, yo, dude, you went over my stuff. Like, he was getting up with little throw-ups and stuff, Sarge or whatever. And if you went over his stuff, he went over you. And, you know, in the dark, when you're painting in a tunnel or something, you know, you don't see a piece, or you see a thing and you didn't cover it correctly, and you left a little bit, and people could tell, and that's why he went over me. It wasn't because, you know, any particular, it was because I went over his stuff.
Got it.
You know,
Right.
and you know, and I kind of understand. And not for nothing, man, you know, he went there and stood up for Cope. You know, for Cope, and all this talk that, you know, the white guy, racist. Nah, man, Cope was Puerto Rican. He was looking out for his boy.
So I have a question. When you were painting, you know, there's this whole thing that people talk about where a tag or a throw up could go over a tag, or a piece could go over a throw up. But what you're saying is that that's not necessarily the case.
That's not the case, man.
Right?
The case
Because
is who the individual is. If somebody doesn't want you going over his stuff, whether it be a tag or whether it be whatever, and you go over it, then you're going to get, you know, it's
Problems.
Yeah, you're going to have problems. And depending on the neighborhood, you know, where you at, you know, it could work out for you, it could not work out for you,
Right.
one or the other.
So, you know, if you were to do it over again, or understand this, you know, people should have respect for other people.
They should, but unfortunately, you know, especially now in the 80s where space was at a premium. I mean, ever since like the media boom where people started going, you started getting people popping up saying they were graffiti writers, and, you know, people that didn't, you know, I hate to say it, there's a few famous people that barely did anything and got props, you know, and I'm not going to name names, it's not about that. But during that particular time in the early 80s, when the gallery started accepting graffiti art, people were coming out the woodwork, and they were talking about, you know, they were getting interviewed talking, yeah, we go into the stores and we rack up paint. And I'm like, dude, man, you know, why don't you just like give the nuclear secrets away? You know, what the heck, man, what's going on here? And I kind of became like, it just, for me, it was a thing where I just went deeper underground. You know, because I wanted to protect this thing, because it was coming to an end, and you could tell it. You could tell. Like, you know, New York City was funny, man, because, you know, I worked for the city, and I know how the system works. I was a civil servant for a long time, and it's all about money, you know, and overtime, you know, and people bringing up their pensions and whatnot. And the transit authority was notorious for, you know, let the trains get messed up. This is money for us to get, you know, overtime.
Sure.
You know? And that's why, but then, you know, at some point where they just said, the heck with it, you know, and let me tell you another funny story with Tracy, all right? So when the new Kawasaki trains came in, the graffiti-proof trains came in, me and Tracy had a Chevy Nova. He painted it prime gray with a Nike swoosh on the side, right? And we literally drove into the 4-yard, okay? This is when the new Kawasaki trains came in. I want to say that was like 1982, around that time. And he opened up the trunk, and he had cases of silver, black, and red, right? And he had it in the trunk of the car. And me being a dummy and stuff, I picked the first box, and I take it, and it was a box of silvers. And he looks at me and said, yo, dude, the trains are silver. Why are you getting silver? Get the black and the red. And I was like, oh, okay. And we went down the line and we bombed these things, man. You know, that's the kind of person Tracy was. That's the kind of person I was. I didn't give a heck, you know.
Eventually, you decided to chill.
I decided
you
to chill.
You had a family. You decided to chill.
That was later on, yeah.
But you know, in the fighting stories that you're talking about, in the wild stories of hanging out with Tracy, there's another side of you, which we haven't really touched upon, or just a little bit, which is, you know, the kind of guy that paints like this. I mean, this is you know, all these styles that we're seeing here. This is for the time, the trains that you were painting with Boozer, or Sem or Ken that you mentioned. They were advanced. This does not look like Zephyr. Does not look like Rasta or Revolt or any of those guys.
That was
you
the
came with
combination.
something different.
That was the combination, man. That was being influenced by Tracy and Padre. Also Phase 2, you know, Riff 170, Nick 707, Knock.
Where did these connections come from? I mean,
the connections, man, was from looking at the cool 131 pieces, the freaking Padre pieces, the Chain 3 piece. Well, Chain 3 was more connections. He was like each individual letter, but the way he laid stuff up. But Knock, To me, Knock was a genius.
Well, here you see, I would say, a bit of knock influence in the
Yep.
character.
Yep. Yo, that was, he did this one piece on the one line where he did the diamond for an O, and he had a little spaceship on it. That was a killer piece, man. I think that was one of his nastiest pieces ever, man. And Padre used to tell me stories about him. Padre used to tell me stories about Butch and Case, you know, and it was like, yo, man, you know, and I wanted to meet these people and stuff. And then I really started paying attention to the trains because, see, back then, you know, we didn't have magazines. We didn't have videos. We didn't have nothing, no internet. What we had was the subway line. And, you know, people went down to the bench, but I was more like, you know, on my own. I would get on a train and just go and end up in Brooklyn and see what's happening over there. I would go down to Manhattan and see what's happening on the one line. I would see stuff that's happening on the 2 and the 5 line. The 4 line I always saw, you know, Chrome 100, The Man, you know. It was just incredible. I started really paying attention, and towards like late '79, I really started changing my style up and getting away from the simpler stuff and getting more technical. And that's when, you know, I started meeting people like let's say I met people like Nomad. You know, this cat was a really great artist. And
Whatever happened to Nomad?
well, the dude's doing really good for himself, man. You know, he's into that digital art and stuff like that. And,
I remember
you know,
him on the 6 line.
Very commercial and whatnot. He went very commercial, and that's what he's doing. I mean, I remember when NFL Monday Night Football, when the robots clashing, he did that. That was Nomad.
Got it.
You know, that's what he went into, and he became very successful, man.
So your style starts to morph into this more technical style.
Yes.
Sort of like an advanced version of what was happening.
Because what's going on now in the 80s, I was getting more exposed to art because of the galleries. You know, I would go to a gallery and, you know, especially hanging out in Henry's studio, you would see all the different stuff. And it was like one of the things that Padre taught me. He says, you know, you don't want to bite somebody's stuff, but you'll see something you like in their piece, and you got to learn how to incorporate it into your own piece. And that's what I learned. And another important thing, and why I'm still, you know, relevant today, is because Padre told me to keep an open mind. He says, yo, you're going to meet a lot of guys, and they're always like, yo, this is the way it's done. This is how it should be. This is what it is. And I get that, you know, and no putting them down or anything, but you can't grow on that. You can't expand on that. You know, I'm not a classically trained artist. I've never had any kind of art training whatsoever, okay? Everything I learned, I taught myself, and I learned from watching others do, you know? And watching, you know, like laying up in Henry's studio, going to these galleries and seeing the way the colors were being used, that just enhanced what I had, you know? I mean, you got to understand something, man. Back in the days, man, we didn't have a lot of colors, man. We didn't have caps. We didn't have nothing. We made up our own stuff as we went along. At some point, I learned if you take a white and a dark green and you spray them together, you get a light green. And you get those blends. And then I start looking at Blade and start understanding how he started doing his thing. You know, because Blade was famous for his blends, you know? And that was the funny thing. Also, you know, we're going to go back to the late 70s and, you know, hanging out with Jimmy Ha-Ha. You know, you started hearing terms like, okay, I'm the king of the J's, T-Kid. You can't be the king of the T's because Tracy's king of the T's. You're going to be the king of the K's. So you start practicing on that particular letter to point you out, you know, to separate you from the pack. You know what I'm saying? And that's what I did, you know. But then later on, I had to learn that I had to learn every letter. You know, and it's funny because I also learned that sometimes my best pieces aren't my name. There's somebody else's name or something I do for somebody else, man. Like, you know, I you know, with my boys, with my crew, you know, and I remember doing an interview with Henry for the Subway Graffiti. If you read the book, you know, I talk about the way you get a lot of pieces done is you get your crew together, you know, and your crew fills in. One guy does the outlines, the other guys, because this was my experience with Pessa, with this cat named Ray's. You know, all these Yonkers cats that I used to hang out with because, you know, my father, after I got shot, my father moved to Yonkers. He didn't want nothing to do with the Bronx. So I went up to, and that's where I met a bunch of people up there, Mike Duss and all them. And we used to go to the yard, to the one tunnel and stuff, and I would crack all the outlines, you know, and then they would come in and fill in them. I tell them, fill this in, fill that in. And we got a lot of cars done that way, man.
You know, one of the things that was interesting about that time of those cars, you know, the stuff that you're doing with Ken and Sem
Oh.
and Boozer
Yeah.
is that you also started incorporating scenery
Yes.
and characters.
Yes.
And there's a car that I remember which was like breakdance.
Oh, the breakdance
character.
car. Yeah.
You know, what was your connection to breaking or to hip hop? What was that about?
I grew up with hip hop. Before hip hop even had a name, we was there at the jams. They called it jams, man. You know, people used to jam out. Let's go to the jam. You know, somebody's throwing a jam in the park or whatever. They didn't call it hip hop. The term hip hop was used. We hip, we hop, you hibbity, you know, all that stuff, man. You know, but before that, man, it was called a jam. You know, you went to the jams, or you went to I remember Cool Herc and the Herculoids coming to PS 123, James Kieran High School, close to Boynton Avenue. It was on, I forgot, Morris Avenue, I think it was, in Bruckner Boulevard. And I remember seeing the flyers and whatnot, you know, Cool Herc and the Herculoids. It was just, I don't know who the Herculoids was, but I knew who Cool Herc was, you know, featuring Shaka Zulu and all that stuff, you know. And it was just like, I was part of growing up with that stuff, you know. Listening to Bambaataa and all that guys. I mean, before you heard the Sugar Hill Gang and
On the radio.
on the radio, you was going to jams to listen to this stuff, man. You know, and when they started playing, when Kool Herc brought it outside to the parks and stuff, it was everywhere. Everywhere you went, we would come from the Ghost Yard, man, and there'd be freaking people jamming on the block, down the block, and we would go wash up in the pump and go to the jam and just chill out. It wasn't too, I want to say, what was it, the OK Harris Graffiti TV that Henry put together. I did a background for him and stuff, and misspelled graffiti. Oh, Jesus, man, I was an idiot, you know? And it's funny because the Ball Busters came down, that was, you know, let's get into beef, you know? Then there was beef with people and stuff. And they came down and broke that up, and you know, a big fight happened and whatnot. And
That's the
but that's
photos
where,
with Rocksteady.
yeah, so it was with the photos that you see me with Rocksteady crew and whatnot. And I remember somebody was like, this is powerful. What do we call this? And I remember, I think it was Take One who said it. Well, yo, it's hip hop, man. And then Martha Cooper said, yeah, why don't we call it hip hop? And that's where that came from.
Right, it started to be
Yeah.
a word that started
word
getting
to-
used.
yeah, and that's
But that's
when-
already the 80s you're talking about.
That's the 80s. Yeah, that's
the 80s.
before, and that's what I'm saying. They didn't
So
call
long
it hip hop.
after.
That was
The whole
after the
70s
fact.
happened, yeah.
That was after the fact. Because it didn't have a label. It didn't have it. They didn't call it hip hop.
Yeah.
Then after that, and I want to say that was 1981. I want to say that was 1980. After that came that book, the Hip Hop Files or whatever.
Yeah.
You know, that came out where Tracy said, I'm his son. And I'm going to tell you what happened. There was
You're
this.
not his son.
I am his son. I am his son, not his biological son, but like I
So
told Mike, I said, Mike, you created me, man. You created me.
But a lot of people, he created a lot of people.
You did.
You know, the whole Bronx, you know,
Pretty much.
basically, or
Pretty
half
much.
of the Bronx.
Pretty much.
Because I think INDs and maybe Phase had the other half of the Bronx.
Yeah.
So listen, you know, we're going to wrap up. We have a little bit more time.
Go ahead.
But I want to ask you about, you know, graffiti culture. And you started to talk about this, OK Harris, you mentioned Fashion Moda. How did you see or graffiti culture moving into the gallery world? Did you find it to be very natural? Did you find anything to be problematic? Because you were there when it started to happen.
The problematic was the exploitation. That was the thing that was a problem. You know, a lot of guys were exploiting and, you know, selling stuff for cheap and whatnot. I was still like, okay, the problem that I saw with it was you're taking my culture, everything, you know, our thing, you're taking our thing and putting it public and, you know, going out there doing interviews and saying this is where we steal paint. Next thing you know, they're locking up the paint, they're fucking hiding the markers and whatnot. You know, and I said, damn, man, that's selling out, man. But, you know, then I started to understand that in order to keep this thing moving, you had to become part of it. You know, if you want to change the system, you got to become part of the systems. Because I was like very against, you know, all that other stuff, you know, the galleries and stuff. And I used to listen to Tracy, and Tracy used to say, yeah, watch it, man. You know, they will rob you blind or whatever, you know, and he instilled that in me and stuff. And I mean, I remember when the movie Wild Star came out, no disrespect to it or anything, but nobody came up to us, you know, to say, yo, can we use Wild Star? The only person that came up to me one time, and I put it together later on, was Zephyr in Central Park. He says, yo, can you tell Tracy to put me down with Wild Star? And I had no clue that they were making a movie, and that was the part of it, so it could be official. And I went up to Tracy. I went up to the Bronx, Morris Avenue. And yeah, yo, Mike, man, what's up, man? Yo, this is this dude. His name is Zephyr. And he didn't even know who he was. He was like, who's that? And I was like, yo, this cat, he gets up, man. You know, he's cool, right? And he goes, I said, he wants to be down with Wild Style. And he goes, does he have a gun? And I said, nah, bro, he ain't that kind of guy, man. He goes, F that, man. Then later on, Tracy, through what Tracy does, found out that they were making a movie, you know. Sure. And that's how we ended up, because let me tell you, we was a little bit disruptive about that and causing problems and stuff.
Well, Tracy ended up suing Charlie Ahern for it and everything.
Yeah, and I remember running into Fab Five Freddy on Times Square. He was coming up, and we were going down the station and stuff, man. And he saw Tracy, and he got very nervous. And then he saw me, and he really got really nervous, because at that time also I had the Vamp Squad. You know, I was down with the Vamp Squad and was notorious for doing messed up things. And he got really nervous, and he tells Tracy, yeah, I was just going to your house. And I look at Mike, and Mike looks at me, and he's like, yeah, where do I live? Uptown, 168th Street. Yeah, where? In the West Side? West Side of what? Manhattan. You know, Mike was not
right,
there.
Right.
And it was just a funny thing, man. And no disrespect to Fab Five Freddy, because what Fab Five Freddy has done for the culture is amazing, and in all due respect, you know what I'm saying? But, you know, that was something that happened.
But, these are street times. These are street things. And these are street people. You're talking about outlaws, but you're talking also about ownership.
Exactly.
And you're talking about commercialization.
Exactly.
And things crossing over.
Exactly.
And money, and, and something that's underground going above ground, and who gets paid.
Exactly.
Right? Or it's independent. It's different, but I get it. It's there's a tension there.
Yep.
Because everybody's hungry. Everybody's got to eat.
Everybody wants something. Yeah.
Everybody wants something. So, last question for you.
Make it good.
It's just my curiosity. You're here at this podcast. It's for the Museum of Graffiti. Museum of Graffiti is a project started 6 years ago to create a space for us, for this movement, for preservation, for documentation. How do you feel about places like that existing?
When I was younger, I would have said, yo, I don't want no part of it. Today, I come to understand that in order for people to remember where it came from, who the players were, who were the ones that influenced this movement that has crossed every boundary possible, from age, religion, race, creed, financial status. Graffiti is the only art form that crosses all those boundaries and talks to people. Reaches out to people. You either got something good to say about it, something bad to say. You always got something to say about it. You know what I'm saying? And now, one of the things I've always said is that graffiti is art. You got to understand my history. I didn't come from places where you had places like this, where people could come and be creative and show their work and be appreciated. I look at it today as something that's necessary to continue educating. This is a form of education of where this came from. To become the great artist that you are, you always have to study the roots. That's why when you get properly trained in art, they go back to, Michelangelo, Da Vinci, and all those guys, to learn technique, how to stroke a brush, how to draw a figure or whatever, everything from shading, to understand letter forms. And this is why, I could get into the abstract art like most guys do. I stay true to the form because this is who I am, and this is the art that brought me to where I'm at today, and I don't change it up. If I'm going to do anything abstract, it's going to be with the letters. My pieces always have letters in them because that's what graffiti is. And I appreciate that there's a place like this that appreciates that understands that. It's not just about the aesthetic of things, but the true nature and the true expression of what a name, to be able to do it different ways for so many years. I'm going to go back to that open mind that Padre told me to keep. I see what's going on around me. I watch, and I become a sponge and absorb everything and incorporate it. Don't bite it, incorporate it into what I do. And then I could come to a place like this and do like that fabulous mural we're doing outside right now.
And you're about to launch a new exhibition.
That's right, man. My show this Saturday, people, man.
Living Wild Style.
Living it wild style, man. That's what it's all about. I am wild style. Tracy 168 told me, don't let the legacy die, man. Keep wild style alive, man. I may not be the president of Wild Style. King 2 is, man, and he's the man, bro. Much respect to King 2, man. you know, but I represent Wild Style to the fullest, man, because that's where I came from, and that's what I do. What I do is Wild Style. And anybody that knows me knows that I not only hit the galleries and paint canvases, I also do other things
Still.
that I shouldn't be doing at this age. But I do them. Why? Because that's what I love to do, and that's who I am.
Tika, thank you so much for your time today, for being a guest on the podcast, and sharing your story with us, sharing the history. It's important for us to document this. It's important for us to know these great artists of our lifetime, the people that are going to be written about in history books in the future, like Tika 170. Thank you so much for joining us, for listening to the podcast, Museum of Graffiti's Oral History, brought to you by Modelo. I'm Ket. T-Kid, thank you.
You got it, my brother.
We'll catch you guys next time.
Peace.
Peace.